Okay, our next speaker is Subbu Vincent. He's Director of Journalism and Media Ethics, Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Thanks for coming the longest way for this conference. And he will go ahead and talk about news and journalistic authenticity, how to tackle the generative AI distribution era. Is that right? Okay, all right, thank you.
So after that super fun session, this is going to be back to the 90s slides. You know, before PowerPoint was invented, you had all these flat slide decks. So please bear with me as I take you back through time, like I think Tamar just said. I'm Subbu Vincent, Sue as in Susan, Boo as in Halloween Boo. Halloween's coming around. That's one way I introduce myself. Just quickly, I'm going to be talking about these three words. They look complex enough. Generative AI is the latest beast in the game. News distribution is all your apps on which you discover the news. And journalistic authenticity is my real interest in the game. I'm going to be speaking about them in an interconnected way. And just before I get into the meat of my talk, I wanted to just quickly tell you what I actually do at a university in a media ethics role. I'm just going to say quickly what my focus is, what's the substance of the work, to who my stakeholders are, who I work with for and discuss about, and so on, and also what forms the interventions I work in take. These are three different aspects of the role. So in terms of what I actually do, it's on the ethics of journalistic works, the actual sourcing of it. So I look at the keywords you folks already know, some of you, source inclusion, just authentic input, I mean representation, and so on and so forth. All of the stuff you heard in the anti-disinformation world about claims, where they actually come from, how do you debunk them? A lot of them has to do with sourcing and sources. So all of these things are in the area, but the place where all of that intersects is news distribution, because what is news and what is not news has been an issue for a while. And that's where the technology piece actually comes in. My work itself doesn't operate on its own. I align with what we call the D word, democracy itself, since media is supposed to serve that. And so I take norms from the democratic space and apply that into actual journalistic work as well. So I'm talking to news people all the time. Every week, there's at least one input. Either they'll ask for a quote, or we'll have a framing conversation, and so on and so forth, on any beat they might be on. Might be an economics beat, it might be a tech beat, it might be actually anything. I also convene news product people, and because I'm at a university, I'm always talking to undergrad folks, grad folks, engineering. Also, interdisciplinary work is involved as well. So just quickly, in all these areas, so just one quick thing. So I'm a source too. So this is a quiet thing. So people, if you get interviewed, you often get asked about your opinion, but I take a step back and ask about what's the story itself. And that helps me understand what they're doing. And then we go actually, back and forth. And then I find that most of the challenges in what a reporter does not happen after they've done the boots on the ground work. It happens before. It happens about how they're thinking about what they're actually going to do. Now let's quickly go to the actual talk I wanted to account for you. I'm going to give you some examples of LLM-based news apps that help you discover the news. And it's going to be interactive. I want to ask you folks a few things as well, because I want to learn what you folks have to say. Then I'm going to connect the dots between how the news apps work and how they connect from how they pull actual journalistic work in the stories that they sort and include for you. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunity, what the opportunity is. I am very critical of the AI framework, but mostly because of how capitalism works to support larger organizations as opposed to smaller firms. But I'm not anti-AI as a technology in and of itself for the moment, at least. And then I'm going to show you one research experiment we did and what that meant to students, how students actually learn how journalism works, because that has implications. So there's a hybrid experiment between the human side of journalistic work and what LLMs can do as well. So that's a little experiment I'm going to share. And then I'm going to share with you what students actually said. So just let me go through some. So I want a quick show of hands here. What are your favorite LLM answer bots that you folks are using now? Can I have a quick naming of what you might be using. I'm just talking about what's beyond Google search. So actual answer bots. Let's go to Sunny. Claude. Okay, that's one. Any other names? Okay, ChatGPT. So that's the actual find. Anything after Claude and ChatGPT, after those two entities came up that you folks are using? Any of the new startups? Have you heard of Perplexity? Gamma. Okay, so there's a bunch. So go to any of these bots. You can go to Claude, or you can go to the one I use for my experimental work. Type those two things there. I mean, you know these things are happening as we go along. I mean, CNN did the first story. If you ask the question, what did a person X post on these sites, you'll get one set of answers. If you frame the question as who broke the story about what that person said on those sites, you get another set of answers. So you can try that. And you can also try these things. Like you take the fact that everybody knows now, like did Clarence Thomas take undisclosed gifts and flights and so on? Or you can ask the question, how did it first come to light that Clarence Thomas took these gifts and so on? If you ask both those questions, see what the answers are in your favorite answer bot and see what the citations are. Again, you can do this on and on for any major story that took investigative work to break the scoop out and all the derivative work that came after that. And you can frame it either way and see what it has to say. So I'm going to show you a few answers. And this is harder to do on actual mobile, and that's why I feel it's important. I'll just come back to the mobile angle afterwards. So if you ask the question on what did Mark post on these sites, you will find that it actually says, yeah, lewd posts were made, and you'll find all these citations, one from The Independent, one from People, Politico, and so on. The story really was broken by CNN. They did the first scoop, and that everybody knows. Why? Because even if you didn't know that, and you ask the question, who broke the story, you'll actually see it says CNN broke the story. So the LLM engine knows how to answer the question, who broke the story. But if you didn't frame that in your question and you simply ask the question, what did they post? They don't necessarily give the elevated sense of what you call citation to the entity that actually broke the story. And in fact, you'll not find it till you go into the citations list and you'll find a derivative story after that. But this isn't just the one thing. You can go to the Clarence Thomas expose. ProPublica broke the actual piece. Within minutes, Raw Story and all the others had their own pieces. So if you go later, like a week later or 2 months later, and you ask the question, you're asking a general factual question to the LLM engine. And it will answer this way. It'll say, yes, Supreme Court Justice did take these gifts, yada, yada, yada. And if you see the citations, Rolling Stone's the first citation, and Rolling Stone will quote ProPublica inside because they're doing journalistic ethics. They're citing their primary source for it, and they know that it was actually that entity. So you'll find, again, you don't see ProPublica here at all, but this fact would not have come out into the world if a bunch of journalists hadn't dug this up over whatever months it took. So you can go on and on about it. And you'll see here, if you ask the question, how did it first come to light that Clarence Thomas took these gifts, you'll see that, I mean, Perplexity or any other LLM engine that's using citations will probably get this right because they can get it right if you frame that question. It's not that they cannot. So same thing, you go to Eric Schmidt's stealth drone project. This was a major story in Jan. It was exposed by Forbes. Forbes did the scoop. They put a YouTube video on it. But again, and there was a spat between Forbes and these folks on this as well. But it's the same broad, I mean, if you see the actual citations, they put the YouTube link of the Forbes expose, which is the Forbes YouTube thing. But if you see their citations logo, you'll see a YouTube logo. YouTube is the distributor of the Forbes video that runs the expose. Perplexity is citing a distributor, not the Forbes link itself, because that's actually another link. So these, I know you might feel like, what is the guy quarreling about? But these little details matter in the supply chain of news on who's supplying what to whom, who's upstream of whom, and who's downstream of whom, and what do people actually see on a mobile phone when your attention is scarce and you're quickly thumbing through and you're asking your answer engine whatever you want to ask. So now, but if you actually look at the YouTube page that has the Forbes video, Forbes itself will cite the actual story they did on the Forbes site. So it's not like these machines don't have a track. They can trace what, they can go upstream and find the original expose that it ran on. So what's really going on here, and that was the point of showing you these screens, is that it is still journalistic investigations that bring the truth out into the sunlight. That is still work that people are doing. What's happening with the LLM summarization approach is that derivative publishers will often get higher citations in the link, simply because they've done the stories later. Sometimes it's just fresh content in terms of updated stuff. Sometimes it's just how these systems are just working, and we'll go into that a bit. But you have to face the fact that some of these truths would not have been known if the first piece hadn't actually happened. So fixing this kind of distributional flattening in the supply chain is what I look at. So that's a media ethics issue, in my opinion. So the one thing I'd say is these apps are not going deep into the actual journalistic sourcing work that led to the story in the first place. You can blame the journalists for it. Like I said earlier, they're not necessarily explaining it, but the explanation is starting to happen, especially in investigative pieces. So, but this, again, you got to seek the authenticity of the work. If you don't seek it, you're not going to find it. So are we seeking it inside algorithms? I don't know. So the extra headache on phones is that your phones are designed already for speed. They're designed for effectiveness. They're designed for helping you find whatever you want to find quickly. So given that, and your attention is under pressure, some of you talked about overload, all kinds of overload. Given overload, given news abundance, given noise abundance, you're trying to find answers fast. But on phones, when you look at news aggregation, the stack your systems have to go through to find authentic work is even harder on those screens than it is on an actual iPad and so on and so forth. So here's the thing. This is not a new problem. I'm not giving you folks a summary of an issue that's new because LLMs came into the world. Ever since technology-based news aggregation has been happening, this is an issue. We've had problems like this earlier. If you go, actually last year when the Clarence Thomas issue broke, I was looking at, news feeds, because that's actually part of my job. I found that ProPublica's piece was in the second page of feeds in a news engine company called Seeker. I'm able to actually speak about this because I've got the screenshots. And the derivative work within an hour of the Clarence Thomas story breaking out was on top. I'm not even talking about days. No LLMs, nothing. It's just algorithms ranking the news. Now, the easy cop-out answer is these people are better at SEO. But my answer to that is we can't rely on people being worse at SEO to not have their sourcing actually count for what goes in as boots on the ground work. So now let's go a little bit into the theory. I'm not going to bore you too much with this, but I want to talk a little bit about what is journalism's authenticity. What's the claim? This is different from personal work. So if you see this, what we're doing is we're sourcing claims, ideas, leads, tips, viewpoints, experiences, and all these things. We source it from people, source it from documents, from sites that we think are authentic, original, and so on and so forth. So what we're also doing is we know that we are supposed to seek out people who are genuine stakeholders on issues. And that's partly, and that is a non-arbitrary decision. If I'm doing a pitch and the pitch is approved, I know I have a lead, I have a tip, I have some idea that this is newsworthy, my pitch is approved. It doesn't end there. I have to go find other people to actually speak to. That decision of finding people to speak to is not a reflexive decision. It's intentional. And that comes from the fact that most complex issues, I'm talking about stories on cost of living and infrastructure and schemes that are supposed to help people and so on and so forth. Most complex issues have stakeholders. They're not one-time issues. They're chronic. They exist out there. And identifying who has stakes is part of the DEI work that you do. And in other areas of work, this is not from the news industry. If you go to basically business, if you go to nonprofits, you'll find that they use internal stakeholder diagrams. They use stakeholder work to actually map out how people are interconnected with each other. They take an issue and you'll find things that say who are the key stakeholders, who are the primary stakeholders, who are the impacted people, who are the least affected people. There is vocabulary that exists in other fields to do this kind of work. Now, here's the interesting part. This is again not new. Reporters deal with these things all the time. So if you ask for an issue that a reporter's been working on for a while, if you ask them these questions, they will either know or they will want to know. That's how original boots on the ground works. Who's impacted, who's making policy, who's exerting influence on the issue, who has power, who has more power and less impact, and so on and so forth, who's actually studied the issue. That would be academics, experts, and so on and so forth. So all of these questions are already there. The issue is, are they driving the sourcing process? And when they drive it, when they actually do that, does it reflect in the actual story itself? When it reflects in the story, you get authenticity. And when all that happens, does the LLM machine, which is going to be used more and more, does it even know how to pull all of that out? So all of those things are issues. But this is kind of what makes journalism stand apart from the noise. And my job is to see in the supply chain, when you get good work, does it penetrate through the actual system, because it's competing with bad work anyway. So now, what is the connection between the two? There's a risk if you try to go into the world we're in now. So we know the actual risks. We know that LLMs are making the cost of what I would call inauthenticity lower. You folks might have known. Have you folks all heard about the Sports Illustrated fiasco? I see some nods. That's a classic case of using LLMs for just doing inauthentic stuff. It was going to happen. People promised it would happen, and it did happen, and more of that might even happen around the world. We're only hearing in America of the English-speaking nations' scams. I'm sitting in two worlds. I look at what's happening in India as well, and there's a whole bunch of LLM scams that happen. In fact, there's a reporter in a northern Indian town's newspaper who made up a quote about Emily Blender, who's a University of Washington professor and a critic of LLMs. She didn't even speak to him, made up the quote and put it in the story, and somebody found it and told her, and she tweeted about it saying, I never spoke to this reporter and I've been quoted. The reporter didn't make up the quote. The machine made up the quote. How did the machine make up the code? You can tell the machine to make up the code. So these risks we know. I'm not saying anything you folks don't already know, but we know that the cost of boots on the ground journalism is what really changes what's going on, accountability, power monitoring, and all of that we know. But if you don't seek the authenticity out there, you're not going to find it. And so the way I frame the actual opportunity in this space is these are language models. They're not information sources. They understand human script, language, words, and so on across the board because they've been trained in that sense. So there is a capability flip already going on. A lot of people are starting to use these to diagnose documents, classify documents, and so on, which is still a linguistic thing. So I feel there's opportunity to apply that to journalistic sourcing. And here's why. News language has sourcing in it. It has words that indicate what people have done, who you've spoken to, and so on and so forth. Names, people, groups who you've offered anonymity to and therefore not named, who you've not named but never offered anonymity to. Both kinds of signals exist in news stories all the time. You've got titles. When you actually quote people, you say, he's a professor, she's the mayor of some town, she's doing this and that. You do all of these things in news. But importantly, you also treat these sources in your language. You introduce them in a certain way. You characterize them in a certain way. You have justifications for why you are including them in the story. And you have an ethics for it. All of those things are unknown, but most importantly is the last bullet. There's an interest now in being methodologically open. You're supposed to tell the people why you're doing the story this way, or what happened, what it took. So the push for that kind of openness is going to increase sourcing signals in the videos, the audios, the text, in the spoken word, in the actual written word, and so on. So if you have LLMs that can pass fancy benchmarks, like LLMs that can pass a bar exam, LLMs that can, as you folks may know, every 3 months, there are benchmarks issued by benchmarking companies, including the foundation model companies, comparing their models to each other. So we need to have a journalistic sourcing benchmark. How do they perform? And when they actually diagnose news? And can they do it? So we did some actual experiments ourselves. We're ongoing. We're overdue on a particular effort. But I'll tell you what types of things you can look for. So from the examples, you probably got a sense that you've got to be able to differentiate news sources in the supply of news across all kinds of ways. Who did the scoop, who didn't, who's including the lived experiences of people, who's including the experiences of people impacted, versus who's including experiences of the views of experts alone. So there's a lot of expert-only and elite journalism that's already ongoing. That's because the system and the field itself has always had a leaning towards elite quoting. So that's known. The issue is there's a lot of change going on. There's plenty of news organizations that are actually shifting it. But can you tell the actual difference when it happens in a breaking news cycle? When something's going on and it's been a day and lots of news organizations have started reporting on it, changing their sourcing, but on the cycle itself. That should be easier to tell if you want to try. So I'll give you an example. So let's take the Vermont House bill. There was a bill passed last year in the State House there about race-based hair discrimination. I didn't know much about this. I didn't know that the hair of Black girls is actually an issue there and how they handle it. And you'll see the story is not particularly different from what you would read in a news story on an actual issue like this. You'll see that the teacher explained that the daughter was reacting to several instances. You'll see quotes there. Now, in a normal news reading experience, if you're already on the story will inform you about what went on in the school, what went on in the State House, why did they pass the law. You'll get a sense of it. But that's if you're on the story itself. And this is VT Digger. It's a good site, vtdigger.com. It's a good local site out of Vermont. Now, we asked a bunch of students, we gave them the actual vocabulary and told them annotate this story by the sourcing in it, and we gave them the source vocabulary. So the first column you'll see is the actual sourcing statements. What are the statements in the story that are attributable to the person the reporter spoke to or sourced from? Because you don't have to speak to a person to source from them. They might say it in a press conference. They might say it online on Twitter. So that'll be a source too. So if you ask students to do this, they will create a table, given that you've given them some orientation over a couple of Zoom calls. They'll actually create this kind of thing. You'll find the sourcing statements, the type of source, whether anonymity was offered, or they're just being unnamed without even stating that. What's the name of the source? What's the title of the source? Are they primary or not? And then the last column is the one that's most interesting for me, that I was interested in the whole LLM project about, which is, are there signals in the actual language that explain what the justification was there to include that source in the story? That's the justification. So you might see that this person is a leader. You'll see in that, if you go to the last one, you'll see that it actually says that particular, you'll see that it represents an actual lawmaker and what that person said during a vote on the bill. So what the person was doing and where the person was doing that when a quote was included is a useful thing to tell the public about why that person has been sourced from. Now look at the machine. So we give the similar training material to the machine using a user prompt and a system prompt. Any of you here, I know there's not a lot of students right now, so those of you who are using AI playground tools can issue prompts from inside the system. So when you use, so this is from Claude, you can ask these machines to actually generate the same type of output that the human students did. What the human students did is called the ground truth, which I review. Then we approve that and we say, okay, this is as close to the ground truth as you can for the story. And then you ask the machine after a little bit of training to produce it. And the machine I expect that the machine will pull out the sourcing statements, because even before large language models, NLP tools could pull out quotes from stories. So language processing is not super new, but what was interesting to me was it can start pulling out source justification. It can start finding those patterns of words in the story where the reporter is signaling what that person has a standing in the story for. For example, one lawmaker is a bill's primary sponsor. That's useful to know. It's easy for the reader to see it in the story, but the machine has to pull it up if you have to do these things at scale. So again, if you see the first item on the list, go to the far right and see the actual justification. It actually says that person faced hair discrimination. That's an example of a few words that say that's a lived experience. You are quoting somebody who's had that experience and you're putting them into the story, and we want to see if the machine will actually pick it up. So I can do this we've actually experimented with more. But the most important thing is you can do this in any output you want. You can do this on a table like a CSV. You can do this as a JSON. This is the one I actually prefer. We convert these into CSV files later. There's an interesting thing about this story's output that you'll see. If you look at the third item on the screen, sourced statement, you'll find it says Caltrans officials were attributed as the source for that, but it actually says unnamed group of people. That's a type of source we wanted to see if it will pick up, because those Caltrans officials were not quoted anonymously because they were worried about something. There was no anonymity offered, no anonymity requested, and yet they're not being named. So I wanted to see if they'll catch it, and it does catch those sorts of things. And so on and so forth. And this is an interesting find, because if you look at the first item on the JSON there, you'll see 3 items on the screen. You see the first one, you look at the actual justification. It says Bay Area resident who was booted from an overbooked flight to Boston. Because the reporter included a quote on that transport story on Labor Day because that happened. So they sourced it from that particular person. I think it was Ellie Mitchell, and so on and so forth. Actually, Caitlin Tharp. So this was an interesting example of what these tools are able to do. But the setup is not as simple as giving it a single line prompt and asking it to do everything. When you work with LLMs, what we've learned is don't rely on them drawing definitions for your ethics from the billions of training data they trained on. That's language patterns, that's prediction, that is stochastic, probabilistic models, all of that in place. You give everything you have to give to see how narrow you can control the domain knowledge of their task. So what we found was you take all the things that journalism is about. This is why I said earlier, journalists do these things, but they don't intentionally explain all of these things anyway in terms of their deadlines and time and professional interest. You take all the words and define it. What's a source? What are the types of sources? What are named persons, organizations, all of those things that we know. And then on the output side, what are they putting out into a story? You define all of those things. And the way you define them is go to plain old Google Docs, write up the definitions using ethics material that already exists, using your own, but do it in as detailed way as you can. So we took all of this stuff up. This was used to tell the students how to annotate the stories. So the students read this stuff and do that Excel spreadsheet that you saw. So that's human annotation. But you then turn them into prompts for the LLM. So you're giving the same training, one set of training to the students. And these are not just journalism students. These are engineering students, poli-sci, comm, and so on and so forth. So it's a good mix. And I've learned one thing. If you can teach any student how sourcing works in a story, it doesn't have to be a news interested person at all. It doesn't have to be somebody from the J school or even comm school. So you take these prompts, you actually create them in prompts. So these are actual plain text prompts that carry the definitions. And then so even the word called justification, like why is the source in the story, you can define that in a way that says, what is the basis for that, and include all of that. And you can tell the LLM examples. This is called the example way to train the LLMs. So, and then you say what output the LLM has to do. So if you see the first line on that slide, it'll say read and analyze the attached news article. So that's the role you're giving to the LLM. And then if you see after that, it'll say, what's the task you're doing? You're organizing the sources and you're listing it out in a format that's a JSON format, and so on and so forth. So my interest is not that, so the intuition that this might be useful was all right. But the issue is, how do you measure the accuracy of these systems? How guaranteed is it that if they're 90% accurate, they're going to be 90% accurate for all the stories you actually try? So that comes down to metrics and so on. That's kind of where we are now. We're basically comparing across about 500 to 600 line items on how good these things are. We have a system, but the paper's not out yet. So why am I calling all this out is essentially that these apps are a new experience. They're an experience because media experiences are changing. As we know, they're changing in every format. They're changing in TikTok. They're changing in the way Kamala Harris decided to show up and call her daddy. Why? Because she wants distribution from those audiences. That host is offering a particular type of media experience for audiences. And people are looking for distribution all the time. At the same time, people are going to apps that are giving them an experience. So distribution is important. And we can't just assume the LLM apps should be treated to the same standards that the previous generation of news aggregation apps were. The only thing is, how do you evolve the system more? Because LLMs have the capacity compared to earlier systems. So distribution is really where my angle is. And that's why I wanted to put all of this out. So what's next? We're planning like a benchmark paper. It'll be the routine academic paper. It'll have a bunch of data on it. It'll have a bunch of scores. It'll tell us whether on justification, are they more accurate? Names and titles, we already know there's going to be a fair bit of accuracy, and we can see it in the data. Because named entity detection is like a already done thing. It's justifications and it's anonymity and it's paraphrasing versus direct speech and all of these things. And also one important thing I'm hoping to find is stakeholder analysis. Like if you take a story on a complex issue and find out what the stakeholders are, the real question is, are those stakeholders represented in the sourcing? If I can get to that, then we have an interesting application that you can use for apps. Now, this is the most interesting part. This is the part I like the most. I want to see what you folks have to say. How many minutes do I have? Is it past time? Nobody's saying anything. So, oh, okay. So I'll stop very quickly. So what did students have to say? So these are actual student quotes from their summaries because they did all of the work and I saw how their work improved over the stories they did. Like the first and second story, they would say it's terrible, but after that they got better at it. So these are things they actually said. On the source justification column, that's the data where they have to explain whether the reporter has explained why the source is there. They actually said all of these things that, this thing provides context, rationale for the inclusion of the source, helping assess why the source is there, relevance, reliability, and so on and so forth. Then if you see another thing, so going over the idea of stakeholders within stories made me actually realize importance of sourcing and how leaving out all of these things, what we talk about perspectives and so on. And then you'll see that people are saying things. So I also asked them, so you'll see this one. So this thing about attributed information, this goes to the heart of provenance. We have a lot of issues on this online in media. So you'll see what this particular student has said. I had very limited info about what qualifies as attributed information, because attribution is at the heart of how we do it. And then you'll find some other things like, so also just quotes, where quotes are from, how they're actually taken, how sometimes you'll quote an organization, sometimes you'll quote an organization through a spokesperson, sometimes you'll quote an individual, and then you'll link it up in a story. So overall, the sense they got was independent of whether there's an LLM's angle to the work or not, just teaching sourcing itself, how it works, was actually a useful exercise. And we had that. So just as a quick wrap, we looked at the case for ethical tech in news distribution, and I'm connecting that to seeking authenticity. And there is a diagnostic opportunity with LLMs more than the generative side. This is why I'm not very thrilled about the actual generation side. As long as there's a human in the loop, I think that's still more important. But I think there's a diagnosis area that they have a strength on. There's a benchmarking experiment we're doing. When the paper is out, we'll release the prompts, we'll release the data sets, we'll release the stories, we'll release everything in a way that people who want to replicate it can actually do it. And I also told you a little bit about what the stakes are. So that's it, people. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
If anybody has any questions, they can bring the mic up to you. Or comments or thoughts.
Questions on sourcing at all?
Right, I see. Oh, let's go up here first. Regimono. Professor.
Thanks, Dan. Excellent presentation. Thank you. I'm just curious about this question of authenticity and whether you see that as a kind of content construction question or an audience interpretation question. Like, who decides authenticity, and is it in the eye of the beholder, or is it something, as you're seeking to do, I think, that can be kind of quantified?
Good one. Thank you for asking. So if you look at how Alex Cooper explained before she put on the Kamala Harris interview episode, because I see influencers do this even better. I mean, I would call that interview a journalism piece because there were good questions asked, they were answered. So journalism as an experience, that episode to me meets all the rules. She had a transparency bit to it before she even put the episode out, where her personal story came out on how she struggled with what questions she was going to ask Kamala Harris. Like, should she talk about everything under the sun, or should she talk only about women's issues, and so on and so forth. That transparency was automatic for her. She didn't have to go through actually anything. That's what I would call personal authenticity. You kind of relate to that person as your podcast host. You get to actually know them. And so you feel like the experience that follows is something that's worth informing yourself on. Now, this part of the actual paradigm is well understood. What is not understood is in journalism, when you're telling someone else's story, how does the public know this is authentic? The way we get into it is you look at stakeholders. Are you representing the actual voices of all the people who have stakes in the game? That you can't tell if you haven't done the stakeholder work. So if people look at journalistic news as just a bunch of flat things that, reporters are used to just, talking about news stories like this is the stuff, this happened, this happened, this happened. I've quoted one victim, I've centered on the victim, I've quoted all these policy people, I'm ending back with the victim, I'm done. Take it or leave it, that's the story. There's a flat way of actually doing that. It's not clear to people reading it whether the people interviewed or accounted for were really all the diverse groups that are supposed to have stakes in the issue. So the more we do that, then in the sense of a democratic, public realm, you get to understand the issue from all sides. So you're searching for authentic views is, can you get people to talk about themselves and their own experiences and how they see this issue, then get experts to talk about them? Because then it goes back to not about us, without us. So there is a part of that is being done by some journalists. It's actually being done. But I feel that the algorithms are not distinguishing between these things. But there's more to go in terms of journalists discussing this and how they do their work itself, that they also account for it and they seek their actual sources. Does that make sense?
I was just wondering, when you were parsing an article, have you looked at scaling to parse a news organization with all their articles for a while? And if that has happened, what is the news organization's welcoming or not welcoming or understanding of the premise to try to parse this with their work? Do they appreciate it? If you've approached news orgs, do they understand it? Do they appreciate it? Do they support it? Or do they fight it?
So Dave knows the legacy of this from earlier. My interest in this began because NLP was already able to access names and so on, and we used machine learning to predict gender. So we were looking at gender in quotes. So at this point, the LLM system is only being benchmarked. We know it can do it at scale if you can run the APIs at scale. We have access to thousands of news articles from hundreds of newsrooms. We have access to a LexisNexis archive. We know the Washington Post produces 250 articles a day. That's the number. So you can process it at scale if you have a benchmark that shows this capacity can be relied upon beyond names and titles. That means actual justifications for source, stakeholders, and so on. So we want to see more work there. But we have an earlier generation of a tech we built called DEI Audit, which was basically just names and quotes. And for quotes alone, we're already able to actually do that. So I know we can operate this at scale, but because I'm coming at it from media ethics, the last thing I want to do is implicate myself in taking a piece of technology to scale without even measuring how it works at the proto level. So what you're hearing about now is proto. Does it work? If so, what's the actual level of accuracy?
I got a question. Just following up. So I found it really interesting, the students and their reaction to the column about stakeholder essentially. Have you tried putting it as well in front? I guess I'd be curious what you think, or if you have put it in front of the layperson, their reaction, what you think they can gain out of it. So I think we're talking about this as like an internal tool of how news organizations can think about their sourcing, but I'd be curious if you've thought about what, if anything, the public might be able to learn or glean from something like that.
I've thought about it more in the sense that it's a downstream design imperative that we can use for journalistic literacy. So for example, if stories have these things in them, then it becomes the responsibility of the news app to compete with other news apps, because in a competitive space where you've got ground news and you've got Seeker and you've got Google News and Apple News and all these apps that you have, including now the LLM apps, who's going to make the first shift towards putting labels on actual pieces that say this article has this kind of source thing in it? I think at that time, there would have to be some actual design to interview people to ask. So the short answer to your thing is I haven't done anything direct with what people will have to say about it, but people tend to experience authenticity as an actual thing. So if you ask people to read a story that's sourced with 2 people and a lot of interpretation versus a story that's sourced with 7, 8 people, different types of people, people feel like they understand the complexity of the issue. So I'm assuming that if we get to that stage of what apps can do, there would have to be actual user experiments. I don't know that there will be something good about it, but I think journalistic literacy about sourcing and explanations is just overdue. And how to account for it down the supply chain, I don't know yet. So good question.